And we've gone through the Red Sea. We came out of Egypt. Pharaoh's power was destroyed. We've gone through the Red Sea. The Israelites got what they wanted, what they'd been praying for so long, and then they didn't want it anymore. And then they did want it, and then they didn't want it. This is what the life of faith is like. And now they've arrived at the place where they'd been headed this whole time, at the mountain of God, to worship the Lord. And at that mountain, they receive the Ten Commandments. We talked a little bit about that mountain last week. We're going to be looking at the Ten Commandments today. And the Ten Commandments are incredibly deep. They are incredibly deep. So today will be a little bit of an overview of the Ten Commandments. And we are actually going to come back to them in the summer, and we're going to do a whole series just on the Ten Commandments in the summer, which will help us go deep and understand them. Hopefully you walk away with some things you can put into action today. But you will probably walk away much like the Israelites, who after they heard the Ten Commandments felt like they just did not, they were overwhelmed. We'll see that when we get to the end of chapter 20 in Exodus today. We'll start out with a little illustration. Does anybody know what this is? It just looks like a random old document, so I'd be surprised if you know what it is. This is one of the many copies. There are actually many Magna Cartas. This is one copy of the Magna Carta. And the reason, this is not actually the very first one that was signed. This is one that was signed, in fact, when the Magna Carta was first signed, then the king tried to get out of it several times because the Magna Carta is a restriction on what the King of England was allowed to do. The first Magna Carta was signed in 1216. I think this particular one was signed in 1290-something. And eventually it was brought in a way that the king could not get out of it, and it became the law of the land in England. And the Magna Carta forms the basis of really freedom, political freedom in the Western world. And every day we live under the results of the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta, part of the reason I showed this particular one is you can see here, it's not actually signed. In 1216, you didn't sign things the way you do today. How did you sign things? Anybody have a guess how you signed it? Yeah, the seal that's right there. This is a wax seal, and the king would imprint his signet ring, kind of like they did in ancient days in Rome as well. And so that is the Magna Carta. Here's an artist's depiction of the first Magna Carta being signed by King John of England. And you can see what's happening here is the priests and as well as the lords in England are forcing the king to sign the Magna Carta. The king did not want to sign it, and the reason is because it is a restriction on the power of the king. The Magna Carta is the first really political document in world history to have restricted the power of a king. Before this, the king was above the law. The king was the law. The king did anything he wanted. Now, the reason we're looking at the Magna Carta just for a minute today is the Magna Carta absolutely 100% is a direct result of the Ten Commandments. Without the Ten Commandments, there would have been no Magna Carta. The real foundation of Western culture, political freedom in Western culture, is the Ten Commandments. Because as we will see, the Ten Commandments apply to everyone in the nation of Israel. The great people and the low people, all the same. No matter what class, no matter what your background, no matter what your gender, no matter if you're a slave or if you're the richest person in the nation, the Ten Commandments apply equally. Equality under the law. And that is what in part, not fully, but in part was forced on King John in 1216. And the reason it was forced on him is because everybody knew the Bible. This was a culture that had been steeped in the Old Testament. And they knew that the Israelites had actually lived for a while without a king. Only God was their king for hundreds of years for the Israelites. And so as we look at the Ten Commandments, we won't go too much into the history of the Magna Carta today, but as we go into the Ten Commandments today, just realize that these have a direct impact on the kind of world that you live in every day, as well as being, as we said last week, the blueprint for life in this universe. They are God telling human beings how this thing called Human Life in the World, How It Really Works. So this has been our series, Freedom from Pharaoh, and also Freedom from Sin. That's what the Exodus brought about. And today we are up to Words from the Mountain. And so we're just going to jump in. We'll jump into the Ten Commandments. This was our image from last week, and this is a famous painting of the Ten Commandments. I guess the Ten Commandments are here. A famous painting of Mount Sinai and the fire and thunder and lightning that were coming on Mount Sinai from 1895, this particular painting. And I think it's helpful. You can see a lot of the Israelites. But it's also unhelpful. What is wrong about this painting? Perspective. There's probably a lot of things wrong about this painting. There's one big thing in this painting that was not there. The Israelites did not see a giant figure of God on the mountain. Moses did go up the mountain, and I'm not totally sure. I think that's meant to represent God in this painting. If it's meant to represent Moses, then it's accurate, but they would not have been able to see Moses from the ground. And it's also that person, if that's a person, is very large in the painting. But Deuteronomy specifically, Moses is very, very clear. The Israelites saw no figure. They saw no form. They saw no image. God spoke to them out of the heavens, out of the clear blue sky. Well, I guess it wasn't clear. It had lightning and thunder going on. But God spoke to them directly out of the sky, but they saw no form. And this is because, as we'll see in a minute when we get to the second commandment, the Israelites are not supposed to worship an image, right? They are not supposed to worship images, which is what everyone in the world at the time did. I think it's hard for us to imagine a world in which every human culture worshiped idols. They made things and then worshiped them. Or maybe it's not so hard for us to imagine because we often make things and are tempted to maybe not worship them in the same way as ancient cultures, but make them the center of our lives. We are tempted to make things and make them the center. The Ten Commandments, before we go through one by one, a couple words about them as a whole. They are not described in the text as commandments or commands. They are commands, but that's not really how they're presented. They are presented as 10 words. That's actually what the Hebrew text says, 10 words, 10 principles that govern the universe. They are 10 words. These are the Lord's, Yahweh, Jehovah's intended order for the universe, how life is really made to function and how you can succeed at life. Let's see, do I have them all? Oh yeah, let's go through them. So, do you know them all? So let's test you real quick. We'll go through them. What's the first one? This is easy. No other gods, okay? What's the second one? No idols, no images. Don't worship things you make. What's the third one? The third one is, yes, don't misuse the name of the Lord your God. Number 4, honor the Sabbath, the 6th day of the week. Honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Interesting. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. What about number 5? Honor your father and mother. Excellent. Now they kind of get easy, right? What's number 6? What's number 6? Don't murder. Yeah. Yeah, not just murder, it's don't murder. You got to be careful, get it right. So you get a few that are kind of easy, and you might almost think these are normal for all societies. What was abnormal, though, was this applied to everyone in the society. Remember what we were saying about kings. Kings in the ancient world, and for most of history, had every right to murder anyone they wanted. In ancient societies, the head of a household had the right to murder people in his own household in many societies. Dad could decide who would live or die. This applied to everyone. Okay, next, what comes after no murder? No adultery. Yeah, do not commit adultery. What's next after adultery? Steal. No stealing. Okay, what's next after stealing? Do not bear false witness, which is not quite the same as lying, but it is lying. Bearing false witness is a form of lying, but not all lying is actually being talked about here. We'll talk about that when we get to it. And the last one, we said earlier in our worship time, do not covet. Excellent. So there are the commandments. There are the 10. And you think, how is he going to do a whole series on this in the summer? Well, you'll see. These are wildly deep. I think maybe I don't have any slides about this. I'll just say a couple things about how they are set up first, the structure of these commandments. So the commandments come in 2 groups of 5. And that makes sense because Moses came down from the mountain with 2 stone tablets. So, it doesn't explicitly say there are 5 written on each one. I don't think it says that, but that's the implication, right? It'd be weird if there were 6 on one and 4 on the other. So there are 5 commandments written on each of these stone tablets. And they are grouped in a particular way. In fact, the first 5 have to do with God himself. The first 5 have to do with how human beings relate to God, and the second 5 have to do with how human beings relate to other human beings. Now, you might have a question. If you were paying attention, you might think, well, wait, what was the 5th commandment? Honor your father and mother. How does that have to do with humans relating to God? It does. It's not on the wrong tablet. We'll get to that in just a minute. So 5 and 5 of these commands, they also come in a kind of structure within the tablets. So they kind of go from most important or maybe highest priority, they go in an order. So having no other gods seems to be primary or seems to be foundational to then not worshiping things that you make, right? And then not misusing the name. So this seems to be the most important one first, and then they move on from there within the tablet. When you get to do not murder, that probably even more seems to us that's the most important one, right? Murdering is worse than, all sin is in some sense equal because it separates us from God, but there are sins with much heavier consequence in this life than others, right? And so murder is the highest here, and then it goes from there down to adultery and stealing and then bearing false witness against your neighbor. And then interestingly, there is a way in which each of the tablets sort of rests on the final command within the tablet. We'll get to that when we get to number 5 and number 10. There is a way in which the first tablet sort of rests on the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. And there is a way in which the second tablet rests on the 10th commandment, do not covet. If you're not coveting, you're going to not do most of these things. See that? If you're not coveting, if you've broken the power of greed and jealousy, why did Cain murder his brother Abel in the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning of the world? Because he was jealous of his brother. So if you've broken the power of coveting, you will break the power of all these other temptations to sin. So there's actually quite a complicated structure to the commandments, even before we get into what each of them are. Okay, now let's jump into them, see if we can get through all 10 of them and say something meaningful about each one of these. No other gods is the first command. And here is how it's written. It's written in, actually this first one comes in 3 verses in Exodus 20. God spoke all these words. As I mentioned before, they're not called commands in the text, they're called words. And notice in this case, even though they are going to be written down on tablets, that's not how the Israelites first received them, is it? They hear the words. And what's going to become clear at the end of the chapter is they have heard. This is sort of the gold standard of seeing a miracle or hearing from God would be if God spoke to you out of the sky with a giant booming voice, right? That's never happened to me. It's never happened. I don't know if it's happened to anyone who's alive today, but it happened to the Israelites. They collectively heard a giant booming voice from the heavens, from the sky, speak to them, and this voice spoke things they did not expect. We talked about last week how these commandments are very unexpected for the Israelites. In fact, unexpected is an understatement. They could not possibly have understood these commandments when they first heard them. And when you get to the end of the chapter, the Israelites will say, don't let God speak to us anymore. If he speaks to us like this anymore, we're going to die. That's how they feel when they hear these commands for the first time. Here's the first command. It sort of comes in 2 parts. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And at this point, that was just a couple of months before this. And then he says this very simply, you shall have no other gods before me. And what I asked you, I gave you, you had lots of homework pieces last week, and I know some of you actually did your homework, so very proud of you if you dug into this last week. I told you it was a trick question. My homework question was, does this command mean that there are no other gods except for the Lord? That he's the only one? Or does it mean he's the first in front of all the other gods? And it is a trick question because the answer to that hinges on what do you mean by the word God? And what is happening here is the Israelites and the whole rest of the world, you got to understand that they could not understand what we mean when we say God today. When you say the word God, what do you think of? If you have a right conception of God, and you will certainly have a conception in some way because of the culture we live in. You might think, the culture we live in is totally godless, right? Or has totally abandoned God, but that's not really true. That may be true in people's individual lives and their will, but much knowledge of God is preserved in our culture. When you say the word God, you don't think of a statue. Most people in Canada in 2025. You don't think of Zeus throwing lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. You think of some sort of being that created the whole, even if you don't believe in God, you think of some being that created the whole universe, that is outside of time, that never changes, that is probably really, really good, loving, has all power, is somehow so far beyond me that it's really hard to understand or even wrap my head around who God is or how he is. You think of the God of the Bible. But people in the ancient world had no such concept. They had never thought of such a thing in their lives. When they thought of God, these Israelites had grown up in Egypt. When they heard the word God, they thought of Ra, the sun god. They thought of Pharaoh. They thought of all the Egyptian deities, which are very much like the Greek gods, which are very much like the Babylonian, Mesopotamian gods, all those ancient gods. Quite a lot of crossover actually to Indian, Hindu gods. And so that's what they thought of when they heard the word God. So it wasn't really possible for the Lord. In this commandment, the Lord is trying to get across to them some of the truth of who he is. But there aren't even words for him to get across this truth. He can't just say the word God. This is the word in the Hebrew, it's the word Elohim. And it is a plural word in Hebrew originally. It just meant all the gods. So one way you could think of how this command sounded to the early Israelites is if we change some of the words, okay? So we're going to change the English words back to something a little bit more like what they would have heard. So for the Lord, we're going to say Yahweh, okay? And so that is the name. It means I am that I am, okay? That's the name that was given to Moses. And so this is part of, he's showing them he's not like all those other gods. But where the word God is, we're going to use the word spirits, because that gives more of a sense of what they heard. When they thought of God, and this actually, what's translated God there is actually plural also. It's plural in Hebrew. So he's trying to break them out of this world that they're stuck in, where they're living under all these really demonic spirits. And here's what he says, if we rephrase it. I am Yahweh. I am your spirits. All of those other gods that you thought you had before, I am all of them for you. I am your spirits who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other spirits before me. So it's a trick question that I gave you. Does it mean there are no other gods? There are no other gods in the way that we use the word. There are no other gods. And that's what he's trying to bring. The Lord is trying to bring the Israelites to understand, but it took them a long time to understand it. That's mostly communicated by giving his name. He is the God who is. He is the great I am. But what he told them in very practical terms was, don't worship any other spirits. For you, I am all the spirits. I'm all of them. Okay, enough on that one for now. We'll come back to it in the summer. Second command, don't worship things you make. Now, for ancient people in every culture in the world, this meant idols. It meant statues. Here's what he says: you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So several of the commandments are highlighted by either a strong warning or a warning and a blessing, or in one case, just a blessing. And so this one is highlighted in that way. What is this command exactly? It's a command in their culture not to make statues and worship them. This might seem strange to us, but you can get a sense of it just in the way that we take things in our lives and have a tendency to make them the center of life. Have you ever had an experience where you were doing something? If you're a young person, maybe it's a video game. If you're an older person, maybe it's your work. Or if you're a mother, maybe it's even your children. And that thing is good maybe in itself, but it became all-consuming for you. It's like it had a grip on you, and you wanted it to have a grip on you, but you also kind of had a love-hate relationship with it in some ways. I mean, that's harder when we're talking about children, but just imagine these moments in your life when that thing becomes the center. And then maybe God's brought you in a process of removing you from that. The human heart is drawn toward idolatry. This is what the Bible says, worshiping things that we make. And the reasons for that are many, I think. The power of idols has been broken in our world by Jesus, by the gospel, and so we don't worship idols as overtly as ancient people did. But I think it's a form of control. You know, if you're worshiping something that you've made, it makes us feel like we're in control of our lives. It makes us feel like we can get what we want from that thing versus the real God who does whatever he wants, not what I want. He does whatever he wants. Sometimes in his grace, he does what I want, but only when it's the right thing for me. So this is powerful, and I want to say on this commandment as well, this one is shocking to the Israelites. Remember, they were brought out to the wilderness, to the mountain, to do what? To worship the Lord. What did they think that looked like? They thought it meant this. You know what they're going to do in chapter 32 of Exodus, which we're not going to get to. What are they going to do? They're going to make a golden calf, and they're going to bow down to it and worship it. And they are doing that to worship Yahweh. They're not doing it to worship the gods of Egypt. That's how they think they're supposed to worship Yahweh, because that's the only thing they've ever seen. That's what worship means to them. You know, like some of us might use the word worship sometimes, or in our culture, people think it only means singing songs or something like that. They thought worship only meant worshiping idols. And now the second thing that this new God that they're following tells them is you can never, ever, ever do that. And I'm sure the obvious question was, what does it even mean to worship you? If I can't do that, that is worship. This is shocking to the Israelites, absolutely shocking. And it takes them, to root idolatry out of the nation of Israel, it becomes incredibly difficult. It takes monumental efforts by the Lord. Number 3, do not misuse the name of the Lord. Here's how it's phrased, just like that. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now, what does this mean? That's the question. And I think on the face of it, when you first read this, the impression most people have is that it means saying things, using the name of God or the word God even, sort of flippantly, or in times when you shouldn't, like saying, oh my God, when something bad happens to you. Now, it does mean that. It does. But it does not primarily mean that. It's not just taking the name of the Lord your God in vain, like the old translation had. It's misusing the name of the Lord your God. And look at the consequence. This is another one that has a kind of threat, a curse attached to it. If you do this, the Lord will not hold you guiltless. The Lord will not forgive this in some sense. I mean, he might through Christ if you repent of it. But the Lord will not just ignore this. It's not primarily talking about like kids on the playground misusing the name of God, although that is in view. But you can think of many ways that people have misused the name of God. When people have done evil because they've said that the Lord told them to do it, God told me to do it. When people have used religion or used God to try to control other people. When people have used God to get other people to manipulate other people and get them to do what they want. This is the main thing that the commandment has in view. And you can see that because that's how Jesus goes after it. Jesus actually, he doesn't quote this command exactly, but he goes after this idea many times. All of Jesus' attacks on the Pharisees are really centered around this command. They are using their position as representatives of God to gain a lot of fame and money and control and power in their society. And Jesus attacks them for it. He goes after them harder than he goes after anyone else. It's this, because they are misusing the name of the Lord their God. This is very important. All right, number 4, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. This one is really surprising because, for modern day Christians, I think for many of us, this is the one commandment of the 10 commandments that it feels like, well, we don't have to do that. We don't have to keep the Sabbath day anymore. But how can this even be on the tablets? Remember, I told you at the beginning that these are not just a list of rules for the Israelites. That will come. He gave them many rules that we don't have to follow anymore. But the 10 commandments are principles about the nature of the universe itself, about reality. How can this one be? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy? Here's what it says. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And what the Israelites meant by that was Saturday. Remember Saturday and keep it holy. Did you keep Saturday holy yesterday? I hope so. 6 days you shall labor and do your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. And this is where you can see it is for sure not just a rule for the Israelites. It is a principle about how God made the creation. Because he says so. The Lord made the earth, the heavens and the earth, in 6 days, and the sea and all that's in them, and he rested on the seventh day. It's a principle that's part of the character of God himself. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, we will say this. Christians are not required to keep the the seventh day of the week, Saturday. They're not required to keep Saturday as a special day anymore. But the principle that there are, and actually Christians changed the Sabbath day in the very early days of the church. They changed it to Sunday for one very important reason. And what is that reason? Jesus rose from the dead on a Sunday. And so the day of worship was changed by the early Christians because Jesus changed everything. But the principle that we will work for 6 days and then have one day that is holy to the Lord, that is an eternal principle that makes human life work. And if you don't follow it, your life will not work right. That is for sure true. I'll say a couple other things about it. We'll come back to it in more detail in the summer. But what I'll say here is sometimes we have viewed this in our modern Western culture as just a day of rest. And it is referred to as a day of rest. But notice that the command has a lot more in it than just resting for one day. And I will say it has two specific additions to resting one day. The first thing is that the command involves working for 6 days. You didn't realize maybe that this command is not just a command to take a vacation. It's a command to work 6 days out of the week, to make sure you are doing productive things as part of your worship, your service to God. For 6 days, you shall labor and do all your work. That's part of the command. So it is not a command for lazy people. That's for sure. The second thing is, even though the seventh day is to be a day of rest, even though it's supposed to be a day of rest in some significant way, what it is primarily is a day that is holy to the Lord. Keep that day holy. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. We said last week a little bit about how we can think about the word holy. We can think about it as sacred. It is something that our lives are supposed to be centered around. It's also supposed to be, holy also means devoted to, only for the Lord. So what the Sabbath day, the seventh day, the day of rest, the holy day, what it primarily is a day that's set aside for your relationship with God. And that involves stopping your work, because sometimes we're so busy and we're all focused on making things, right? This also points back to that second commandment. Don't worship the things you make. Don't make them the center. And one way we do that is one day a week. We don't work on all those things. We focus that day on the Lord. But it doesn't just mean a day where we sit around and watch TV and sleep in really late. That's not primarily what it is. It's a day that is holy to the Lord. All right, tons more to say there, but we'll move on, see if we can get through these commands today. Number 5, honor your father and your mother. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. I'll only say just 2 things about this commandment right now. 1, why is it on the first tablet? Why is it on the tablet that has all the commands about how human beings relate to God? Because you didn't pick your father and your mother. You didn't choose them. They were given to you by whom? By God. And so if you don't honor your father and mother, and we'll talk about in a second what that means to honor them, you don't trust the Lord. You don't have faith that He's been good to you in your life. If you have deep down this sort of bitterness and you feel like, my parents are horrible and they really mistreated me, my life would have been perfect except I had these parents. If that's your attitude, you don't trust that God is good to you because He's the one who gave you those parents. That's why it's on the first tablet. Now, the second thing I'll say about this is, for many of us, we had great parents and we can just focus. No parents are perfect. We could just focus on the good things in their lives that they did, that they brought to us, and it's easy to honor them. For others, we had parents who did not follow God, did not follow His teaching, maybe really did harm in our lives. There are some parents who are really awful. How in the world do you honor parents in that situation? Well, you still do it. This is not a command to obey your parents. Notice that. This is not a command for children. There are commands in the Bible for children that say, obey your parents. You find that in Ephesians chapter 6. But here, this is a command for grown-ups. Honor your father and your mother. And how you do that, if your father and mother were really bad, maybe they never did one good thing in their entire lives. It's probably not true. But let's just say that were really true. You honor them by thinking about what God made them to be, even if they didn't live it out. Because you are intimately connected to them. And there is no way you can be truly content and thankful for who God made you to be unless you can honor your parents in that deep way. Unless you can say, maybe my parents were horrible in a lot of ways, but I see what you made them to be. I see the good thing, God, that you were trying to do through their life. And I see how you're now trying to do something maybe related, maybe similar in my life. This is why it's on the first tablet, and that's how you do it. All right, second tablet, now we're into things that are between human beings. Do not murder. Why? It might sound so obvious, right? You almost can't come up with an answer to that because it's so obvious. Doesn't everyone know not to murder? No, everyone does not know not to murder. Definitely not. The command is very short. These are the ones you read through and you're just like, oh yeah, you don't really think about them because they're so fast and they're so obvious. Remember what we said. A couple things about this one. Remember what we said. This applies, it's shocking because it applies to everyone in the society. And now it applies to everyone in the world. You shall not murder. It doesn't matter if you think you're way better than that other person. It doesn't matter if you think they did really bad stuff to you. It's not a command not to kill, actually. It's a very particular word, murder, and it means what our word murder means. It means that you choose on your own, because of hatred or animosity, to take away the life of another person, on your own authority. And that's the second thing I'll say about it, is that the reason for this command is the Lord. The reason is the Lord. Life does not belong to you. None of it. Not your life, not the life of the person next to you. You cannot take another life on your own authority. Not even animal life. You take animal life under the Lord's authority because He's allowed it. You cannot take the life of another person under your own authority. That's why it's not a command. There is execution by the society in ancient Israel, and those were under the commands of God. You can take away the life of a human being in these particular situations by God's authority, but not under your own authority. It's not yours. Human life, all life, is holy to the Lord. Do not commit adultery. Why? This one actually, we'll need to go deep into this in the summer because this is one of the commands that is invisible to people today. This is one of the commands that I think many people in our society look at and go, that doesn't make any sense. Why would it be wrong to do that? Especially when you understand what it means. Now, it does mean, so if you're married to someone, don't cheat on them. That's what the word adultery means, yes. But it includes much more than that because in this society, everybody knew. It wasn't like our society where people were living together and they thought that was cool and you couldn't see why that was wrong. That is included in the word adultery here. This means no sexual relationship except inside a heterosexual marriage, period. That's what it means. And many, many people have huge difficulty seeing why that could ever be. It's because we've forgotten or we've lost in our culture just what sexuality is. Sexual intimacy is not just a physical act, not by a long, long way. It is deeply spiritual. And that's why all the pagan forms of worship, all of those idolatries that the Lord had talked about, almost every culture in the ancient world, guess what was involved in their worship? Sex. Actual temple prostitutes. That's how you would worship the demon gods of the ancient world, because it is a spiritual act. And we can't get deeper into it than that today. We'll go into it more in the summer on just why that is and why it's not just zero consequence to you if you decide to go sleep with someone you're not married to. Even if you're not married, it's not zero. It's deep consequence. Paul says it's a sin against your own body. Do not steal. Why do not steal? Why? What if I deserve the stuff that other person has and they really don't deserve it? Shouldn't it be okay? I mean, many people in our society today, I think, believe this. Maybe they don't call it stealing, but they think if there's a person who's really not deserving of this thing or they have more than maybe they should have, it should be taken from them and given to me because I deserve it. Why do not steal? Because a human being has only what is given to them from above. What you have is what God has allowed you to have at this point in your life. And if you trust Him, that's all you need. If you trust Him, what you have right now is the very best for you right now. and it will not be good for you to take from another person. Also, God is highly in favor. You can see freedom running through all of these commandments. He is highly in favor of a kind of personal, individual freedom. Each human being has been given certain things by God, and it is not okay for other people to break into that and take it away in any form, because that's overstepping their authority. God has set limits, and you have to live within the limits He has set. Do not steal. You probably don't struggle with this, though, right? If you do, come talk to me. But most people don't struggle with do not steal in our society. Do not bear false witness. We're getting close to the end here. We'll wrap it up in a couple minutes. Do not bear false witness. This one is not all forms of lying here, because you can imagine times when the right thing to do is lie. I know that sounds odd, but if the Nazis are knocking at the door and you've got Jews hidden in the basement, and the Nazis say, "Do you have Jews hidden in the basement?" What are you going to say? No. You're going to say no. You're going to lie. And that's going to be the right thing to do in that situation. Now, those situations are rare, thankfully. It is almost never okay to lie, because most lying is a form of bearing false witness. What does that mean, bearing false witness? Well, you can imagine it in a courtroom. Somebody's on trial, and they're asking you, did this person do it? And you know they didn't, but you don't like that person. Or that you have some interest, you have some vested interest, you're going to get something out of it. So you lie. In that situation, in a situation that has consequences for the other person and maybe gets something for yourself, that's bearing false witness. But it's not just in a courtroom. It happens all the time. This actually could encompass anything we do to try to manipulate other people. Any false impression we give to make other people think that I'm better than I really am, or to get people to do what I want them to do, any form of manipulation falls into this 9th commandment. Do not bear false witness. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And finally, do not covet. And we said earlier, this one is amazing, stunning. I don't even know what to do with it in the context of ancient Israel and ancient worship in some way, because it's like many of the teachings of Jesus. It goes not to human behavior, but right to the heart. We read it during our offering time, but let's read it again. I love this commandment because I love that he tells you not to covet somebody's ox or donkey. I just find that part really entertaining, because I would never think to covet someone's ox or donkey. But it shows us how in our society there are things other people have that we want. And it's really all about sort of greed and jealousy, and how I want to be better than the other person. Because you take someone out of that society, put them in our society, we covet totally different things. It's not really about the thing. It's about thinking you're better than someone else or trying to be better than them. It's about making yourself God. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his donkey, his ox, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Powerful, powerful words. And as we said earlier as well, if you break the power of jealousy and greed, coveting in your life, those previous commands will become very, very easy. Now we'll just wrap up. I think I've got the scripture here. Yeah, we'll just wrap up by reading this, and then we'll end our time in the Word today. But look how the Israelites react to this. For us, you might read these words and think, oh, of course, or yeah, I've heard these many times. When these were heard for the first time, by the voice of the Lord speaking from heaven, it shocked the Israelites to their core. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, and here you're going to see, it's not just the lightning and the smoke and the thunder that's scaring them. Actually, there's something that's scaring them much more than the lightning and the smoke and the thunder. They said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, Moses, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us anymore. or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.